I just saw an interview that was done on the Honest Youth Pastors channel. Shout out to the Honest Youth Pastor. It was actually a pretty good interview where he interviewed two young adults, a married couple, on their mission to start a church, or I'm sorry, that's exactly what they didn't do, but their mission to start a club in LA. So they're starting a nightclub for Christians in LA, or they've already started it, really. And I guess they uploaded some promotions and some thoughts on Instagram that caught, the Honest Youth Pastor's eye. And he ended up responding to that, and many more people ended up responding to that with some critiques on what they're actually doing. But then he actually interviewed them. They linked up. I think they reached out, and they ended up having a good dialogue, which is beautiful, right? I mean, you should be able to talk through some of these differences, especially if there are non-essential differences, and hear other people's views. And so it was a good interview, but they talked through some things that I think were very interesting, but I think there's a part here that's being missed as it relates to this Christian nightclub that was created. Is why, why is there a need for these young adults to create a space where they can express themselves in unique ways through artistry and all of the likes? Now, this is nothing new. There was a hip hop church some years back. There has been singles ministry clubs. There's been this type of stuff happening forever. But I thought this was a peculiar conversation. Not that it was anything different than, what they were doing, but I think there were some parts that were missed here. The Honest Youth Pastor was asking some really good questions in terms of, why they're on this mission to do this. And then he was also saying, why can't you do this in the church? And this is what I think is missing in this conversation. And they were going there, but they didn't want to. And listen, shout out to them, because, they were doing their best not to put any of the people that are walking with them in this in harm's way. They were really wise about how they were talking about the community and the church and those individuals they're affiliated with. They did a wonderful job navigating that. However, they were hesitant to speak on, I think, some of the issues that they may be facing as it relates to creating this type of space in a local community. Now, it's my opinion that most of these things exist as a response to what's not happening in the church. Just like, parachurch ministries exist because of what's absent in the church, right? We don't see the church functioning properly in these certain areas or utilizing resources wisely in these specific areas. And so somebody will create a parachurch ministry, to reach that particular unreached group, because the church is not doing that. So a lot of this stuff exists because the church is not functioning there. And I think that's the part of the conversation that's not being had. I mean, this has been going on for centuries as well. I mean, honestly, there would be no black church if it were not for the white church, right? Excluding black folks. And so having to create their own space to actually worship God, it's the same thing. It's a lot of this stuff usually happens because the church is not leaning into being the church, right? An all-inclusive community that represents all age groups and all people. And those individuals have value to add to that particular community expression, right? And the thing that they didn't get into is why. Why can't you do this in the church? And again, they touched on this. I'll drop the link below so you can see the interview, but they touched on this stuff. But the reality is that they didn't get into why this stuff happens. Like, why is the church not allowing these things to take place? And again, I think that the church is at fault. Okay, I do. I believe that the church has created a culture of people who feel like they need to go outside the church to a large degree to express themselves or to find community, because community is not necessarily happening in the church. The church is talking about these things, but the church is not doing these things. And so when you see young people go out and do something, the church says, well, listen, they either demonize it, right? They either will say, listen, that's not biblical. That's not right. You're not worshiping Jesus. That's ungodly. You're too cultured, all of that type stuff. But on the other end, they say, you can't do this in the church, right? So where else are they supposed to gather together and express themselves in a way, if not in the community or with the community of God? And let me say this, I'm not even talking about necessarily a separate space. See, and this is where, I think things get really tricky, right? Because we've also segregated within the church, not in terms of race, but in terms of age. The church is very segregated in everything that it does: youth ministry, young adult ministry. And listen, I was a former youth pastor. And so I understand, and I created venues for young people to express themselves outside of the larger parts of the ministry. However, the church is very much segregated, and so we create these spaces really because we know that there are certain folks that can't tolerate certain things. Now, we'll say it's discipleship, but it's not discipleship; it's preference, and preference is okay as long as it doesn't discriminate. As long as it doesn't treat people differently. We can have preferences as long as those preferences don't rule our spirituality. And so I want to kind of speak to you a little bit as to why these things do not take place in the church. Maybe some things that they did not say and could not say, and maybe they don't feel this way, but this is what I've experienced being in the church. So many of these things exist because of the lack of what's happening in the church, right? So these things are created because they're not happening in the church. But one of the main reasons that these things are created, whether it's a nightclub for Christians or a hip hop church, or is really because of the power dynamics that exist within the church. Now, again, being a former pastor who has worked on staffs, who has served as youth and young adult, pastors, leader, all of that type stuff, I've experienced these power dynamics, especially when it relates to the young adult youth population. They're not seen holistically as a part of the community, right? Because they can't participate in all the ways that most of the adults can. And primarily, that's a financial thing. And it's just the truth, especially as it relates to the African American church. This is, a big thing, right? Where the individuals who are able to contribute in certain ways have the say in the church. Now, I'm sure that this exists in every, community, but I'm familiar with some of the communities that were mentioned in that interview. And I would just go out on a limb and say that those dynamics exist, right? So young adults don't generally have a say in how the community goes and how things happen within the community. There can be suggestions, but it doesn't necessarily mean that those things are going to be put in play. I remember I was a youth pastor and we were having the typical thing that youth pastors do. I don't know why I threw up the air quotes, but the typical thing that youth pastors do, which is a shut-in, right? All youth pastors have a shut-in, a lock-in, whatever you want to call it, where, you have 100 kids who are foaming out the mouth and throwing up food all night because they ate too much pizza. And it's the worst thing in the world. I hate shut-ins. I just hate it, honestly. And so anyway, we were having a shut-in and we were planning it out. And we had just built this building, beautiful space, but it was the sanctuary was a multi-functional space, meaning that we didn't have pews. We had chairs that could be picked up and moved and different things of that sort, and it was a large space. The space held about 1,300 folks. And so you can remove all these chairs and it could be used as a multi-functional space if necessary. And so we were planning this shut-in, and I went to the leadership and said, hey, I would like to move a portion of the chairs in the sanctuary to put, maybe some, jump, bounce houses or, some activity spaces within the sanctuary, right? Within the sanctuary so that, kids can, spend time there and have fun, because we had zones that were being set up. We couldn't do it outside. Obviously, we had this big space. We wanted to be able to utilize the full space. And so, the answer was no, we could not do that. And the reason why we couldn't do it, there really wasn't a reason other than we don't want them to tear up the church. You know what I mean? And again, so, and let me put it this way. So the reason was they didn't want them to tear up the church, and they couldn't justify that to the older community that kids were playing inside of the sanctuary. And so the power dynamics wouldn't allow for certain expressions of worship or certain expressions of life for young people within the church. And so, how do you convince the church that this is a way that we could reach other young adults, or this is a way that we want to function within the community if they don't have power to do so? And so I'm sure that they had conversations with leadership. I'm sure that they had conversations with individuals about what they wanted to do, but it probably got shut down. And truthfully, it's easier for the church to deal with when it's not a part of the community, because they don't have to answer for those questions, or they don't have to support it in that way, and have the tough conversations of pushing people to accept what they don't like. Now, this is what's interesting to me, and I experienced this a lot when it came to youth ministry, and this is just an interesting dynamic to me. I never really understood it. A lot of concessions are made for individuals who are older, meaning like the individuals who are older and mature are the ones who get served in terms of we don't want to offend them. But they're the ones that are supposed to be older and mature and should be making the concessions for those who are younger and immature, right? It's opposite. So we actually cater to those who are supposed to be the more mature ones, right? And this is why, you'll see these things created, is because there's no form or space for them to happen in the church. And I'll tell you whether or not I agree with this, or anything like that, because I do have some pushback. I'll get to that at the end. But these things exist because the church simply won't lean into them. That's just the reality. Also, another thing is that the church doesn't take risks. The church doesn't, engage in costly evangelism. Jesus risked his reputation for people who are far from him. Right. He risked his reputation. He was called a friend of sinners. What's interesting is that the church feels like our greatest witness is holiness or being separate from the world. And so the church is not going to take a risk in partnering with individuals who are different than them, or who may do something that's a little bit borderline, risky. And so the church doesn't necessarily want to be a part of that, So I heard in this interview a lot of like the church is saying like, well, what if something happens, or if something goes down, the church doesn't want to be responsible for that or be held accountable to that. And, no risk, no reward. You're not going to reach young people or reach the world or reach culture if you don't risk. And again, I see this in Jesus. He was willing to go out to the highways and the byways where individuals were sick and needed a doctor, right? I mean, people will not touch those who had leprosy, and Jesus would approach them with the good news. And so part of the reason why these things exist is really because the church is not willing to take that risk. And so people who are open to moving in that way and creating spaces of worship that entails some risk in order to reach those who are far from God, again, they have to go outside the church to do it because the church is not willing to take that risk. Now, how do I feel about this? This is where, you guys might start feeling like I'm a little schizophrenic in my theology, right? Like I'm a third way guy. I'm telling you now, I see things in the gray. I'm not for a whole lot of things, but I'm also not against a whole lot of things. Excuse me. I'm not for a whole lot of things. I'm not against a whole lot of things. I kind of want to just think through them in a way that's healthy and process them. And in this particular case, I'm not for it or against it. You know what I mean? I see the benefits of it. I see the positivity that can come out of it. I see the need for it. I understand why it's being done. And I think some of those things are very valid. I think that some of the things that are being done just don't fit in our modern church context, and they never will. And the church has to be okay with that. The local church can't control every part of community, and they don't control every part of community, right? Fellowship is not driven by a building or a place of worship. Fellowship is driven by relationships of the people of God. They can't control community and where community happens, but some things are just not going to fit within our expression of church in modern culture. It's just the reality, right? And again, maybe the church is just not willing to go that far. Okay, well, these things are going to happen. You're going to see other ministries formed outside of the church. And instead of demonizing, or instead of criticizing, or we need to engage and provide service and provide resource in order for these things to happen, and invest in it, shape it, help bring, a holistic mindset to those things that you feel may be out of balance, right? But here's my thoughts. Let me get to my thoughts, because now I'm on one. But let me get to my thoughts. Here's just some concerns that I have with these things, knowing that these things are needed and that these things can happen, will happen, and that they do serve a purpose. I also think that there's some dangers here, some things to be concerned about, right? Expressions of faith are just that. They're expressions of faith. They're not the totality of faith. And I think when it comes to young adult community today, they put a lot of emphasis on their expression of their faith, right? But your identity is not rooted in what you do. Your identity is rooted in who you are. And so when we create ministries based upon expressions of faith, it can be dangerous, because then that becomes the catalyst for a person's faith. So that's one thing that can happen in situations like this. Another thing is it unintentionally forms spirituality around an event, right? A person's spirituality becomes formed around an event. And the truth is, this is not a real expression of what the totality of of a relationship with Christ is. There are many facets to walking with Jesus, and not all of those facets are joy in terms of expression, being happy and turned up and all of that type stuff is not like the full expression of Christ. And so what we end up trying to do is we end up creating a persona of the Christian life that's just not the reality. There's going to be tragedy. There's going to be trials and tribulations. It's not all going to be happy and good. And so I know that they're saying that this is not the end all be all, but not everybody there is understanding the totality of Christian faith, which is why we need to be in relationships that are beyond just our expression. We need to be in real deep relationship and fellowship with others. Here's another thing that these things, when it comes to evangelism, when we try to make Jesus attractive, we don't need to make him offensive. We don't need to make him more offensive than he already is. But when we try to make Jesus attractive, when he's already countercultural, to the core, like, let me put it this way. We can't really make Jesus attractive because his ideas are countercultural to the world, right? When you have a culture and a community that is built around living a specific lifestyle, there's certain parts of Jesus that are just not going to get down with that. Right. And so you're going to have tough conversations, and you're going to have really difficult situations that fall outside of, this is cool. However, I'm not willing to commit that because I don't want to give parts of my life to that. And so we just got to be careful that we're not making Jesus attractive in a way that's pulling down the parts of his teachings that are countercultural. Because the reality is, if you see Jesus in a clear picture, he pushes back against a lot of the things that we push for within society and culture. And then lastly, I'll say this. I used to say this all the time. How people enter the kingdom is how they live the kingdom out. How people enter the kingdom is how they live the kingdom out. And so we set expectations of what the Christian life is going to be by how we give them Jesus, right? And this is huge with evangelism, right? If we preach Jesus as a get out of hell free card, then generally you'll have Christians who don't really produce anything in their faith because they got what they needed, right? They are no longer going to hell. And so I understand discipleship is important in that, and hell is a motivator. Or let me say this, life after death, whether that's with God or not, is a motivator. Right. So I get that. However, the point of Jesus is not escaping any type of damnation. The point of Jesus is that he gives us abundant life. He gives us life with himself. He himself is the reward. So what do I mean by this? If we sell the kingdom as a party, then people will expect it to be a party. You understand? They'll live out their life. And when hard times hit, their theology will not last because they don't have an understanding that the Christian faith is not built around a single aspect. The Christian faith encompasses all types of stuff, right? I mean, think about this. Our Savior died, right? He was executed, murdered in a horrific way, right? So his glory was in line with his death, right? And as Christians, we are individuals who are called to die to ourselves daily, right? To deny ourselves of things that we may even desire, right? To endure within the Christian life. So we just got to be careful of giving people a one-dimensional perspective of what Christian life is, especially with young people, because when hard times hit, and they do. And when depression comes along, as was talked about, when life doesn't look the way they desire it to look, their theology has to be solid enough to carry them through those dark times. And turning up is not enough, right? And so there needs to be balance. There needs to be balance. So in one aspect, just to close this up, the reason why these things exist is because the church allows it. The reason why these things exist is because the church does not allow these things to take place within the community of the church. It doesn't fit the American church paradigm. We're afraid of things that look different. We're afraid of things that don't fit within our certain way of doing things. So they get pushed out into the margins. And this is why these things exist. If the church is upset about this, then they need to be upset about parachurch ministries altogether, because that's why parachurch ministries exist, because they exist in spaces that the church doesn't. They do ministry in a way that the church has failed, to be honest with you, and they've picked up the slack when the church should be the one who's driving these particular instances, right? And so they fill the gaps, right? And then to be honest with you, the church doesn't want to do risky evangelism. It's sad to say, but, the church, sees its primary witness as holiness when that's not the primary witness of the church. It's love. That's the mark of the Christian church, is its love. And Jesus demonstrates that, where he's willing to give the gospel to people who are far from God, who are practicing lifestyles that don't look like his, who are people who are different than he is. That's the mark of Christ's ministry, and we should follow that model. However, in saying all of that, there are some concerns that we should be aware of, right? It's not all about having fun and being turned. It's not all about the expression of our gifts. And let me say this, because I'm a person who loves the artistry. You are not your talent, right? Your gifts are not you, right? And so the most important thing about you to God is not what you can do for him. The most important thing about God is you. And so you are not your gifts. So your expression of him is just an expression of who you are, of your gifts and talents, but it's not you. And so when we create venues surrounding talent and gifts, that can be dangerous, obviously, because it creates a facade that what we do for Christ is more important than who we are, and that that is how the totality of the Christian faith is expressed. Now, I'm not saying that this is what's happening there. I'm just saying that these are things that we need to watch out for. So that was a lot. That was probably a little bit more than I wanted to give. I thought I was going to be on here for 2 or 3 minutes, but that turned into a little bit of a longer a podcast. So if you wouldn't mind, like, rate, and subscribe. I'd love to hear your comments. Also, visit the Honest Youth Pastors channel. I'll put the link below where you can see the video, and then the information for the individuals who have the nightclub or the church. Yeah, the nightclub for young adults for Christians is also linked in his channel as well. And I'll try to link them here on my channel as well. So anyway, just wanted to kind of give my 2 cents on that. Thank you so much for joining the Church Dropout podcast. I'll talk to you soon. God bless you.